Imagine you are planning a massive cross-country road trip today.
Oh, like pulling up your phone and just typing in a destination.
Exactly, yeah. There is this incredibly comforting expectation of just, well, total precision that we all basically take for granted. You type a city into your phone, and instantly, this glowing blue line dictates your entire
Yeah,
future.
it tells you exactly where the turns are.
Yeah, it warns you about traffic jams like 3 states away. It points out the gas stations. It estimates your arrival time down to the literal minute. You are operating inside this entirely predictable, closed system.
It's a heavily curated reality. I mean, the path is known. The variables are managed by algorithms, and the physical environment has literally been paved over to accommodate you.
But I want you, the listener, to just imagine driving to the very edge of your town, and suddenly the digital map on your dashboard just glitches out and completely disappears.
Oh, wow.
And I don't mean you just lose cell service and have to look at a paper map in the glove box. I mean, the very concept of a map ceases to exist.
The asphalt just ends.
It ends. The blue line vanishes into a literal blank white void. And then you look in the rearview mirror and you have 32 other people in the car staring back at you.
No pressure, right?
Right. And they are relying on you to navigate a continent that no one in your entire society has ever seen, let alone actually mapped.
I mean, that is the absolute definition of stepping off the edge of the known world. And historically speaking, it requires a psychological toll that is almost impossible for a modern person to fully wrap their head around.
And that psychological cliff is exactly where we find ourselves today.
Welcome back to this deep dive into the source material. We are just so thrilled to have you with us because today we are embarking on part 2 of our 4-part exploration into the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Yeah, and in our first installment, we covered the initial preparation and their brutal first winter locked in the ice. But now, I mean, the training wheels are completely off.
They are off.
Yeah.
So what is our specific mission for this deep dive today? Our mission today is to strictly follow the timeline of events from April to August of 1805. We are looking at a period that is just entirely defined by catastrophic logistical nightmares, encounters with wildlife that completely defy their understanding of biology, and really the violent, heartbreaking shattering of a geographical myth that had driven European exploration for centuries.
So let's just set the stakes here because they really cannot be overstated. It is the spring of 1805. You have an expedition of 33 people, 2 massive wooden pirogues, 6 dugout canoes, and a mandate directly from President Thomas Jefferson to find a commercial water route connecting the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
They survived the winter in what is now North Dakota, but as the ice breaks on the river, the true unknown basically begins.
The physical journey into that unknown officially starts on April 7th, 1805. The expedition breaks camp, they depart their winter quarters at Fort Mandan, they push westward up the Missouri River. But the thing is, April 7th isn't just a departure date, it is a critical moment of physical and psychological separation.
Yeah, because I was reading about the split in the sources, and it sounds incredibly dramatic. They actually divide their forces here, right?
They do, yeah.
They send their massive 55-foot keelboat back down the river towards St. Louis.
Right. They pack that keelboat with a dozen men, and they load it with basically everything they have accomplished so far. We are talking about intricately drawn maps, detailed reports for President Jefferson, and crates of natural history specimens.
Like stuffed animals and botanical samples.
Exactly. Even live magpies and a live prairie dog.
Oh, wait, a live prairie dog?
Yes, somehow.
How do you even keep a prairie dog alive on a keelboat for months? That is wild. But so, if things go horribly wrong out west and they all die, this keelboat is essentially the physical backup of their entire scientific mission.
That is the perfect way to contextualize it. It was their legacy insurance. Once that keelboat drifted out of sight down the Missouri River, the permanent party was entirely cut off.
Wow.
What remained was a streamlined, highly mobile force of 33 individuals. You have the co-captains, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. You have 29 enlisted soldiers and civilian French-Canadian rivermen, known as engagés.
Right.
And then you have this family unit that completely breaks the military mold.
Which is so fascinating to me.
It really is. You have the Shoshone teenager Sacagawea, her infant son Jean-Baptiste, who they called Pompey Clark's enslaved servant, York.
So this small, incredibly diverse fleet of canoes and pirogues starts rowing into the upper reaches of the Louisiana Territory. And almost immediately, they encounter a reality check that just completely shatters their confidence.
Oh, absolutely shatters it.
I want to talk about the mindset of these men going in because reading their early journal entries, they sound almost arrogant about their survival skills.
Arrogant is the right word.
I mean, these were seasoned woodsmen. They grew up hunting the American black bear in the dense forests of Virginia and Kentucky. They firmly believed they were the apex predators of this continent.
Right, they were marching into the western wilderness, carrying a very dangerous amount of technological hubris.
Yeah.
They looked at their weaponry, which were standard-issue military muskets, and the incredibly accurate .58 caliber Kentucky long rifles. And they just assumed they held absolute dominion over nature.
To give our listeners some context, a .58 caliber rifle in 1805 is basically a hand cannon.
Pretty much.
So when the native tribes at Fort Mandan spent the whole winter warning them about the immense size and the terrifying ferocity of the white bear, which is what we call the grizzly bear today, the explorers just sort of smiled and brushed it off.
They completely dismissed the indigenous knowledge. They assumed the native accounts were heavily exaggerated stories.
Right.
The captains reasoned that the tribes were terrified of these bears simply because they were hunting them with bows, arrows, and inferior low-velocity trade muskets.
I keep trying to wrap my head around their logic here. It feels like someone walking into a war zone with a standard hunting rifle, assuming they can take down an armored vehicle just because they are a really good shot.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
They assumed the western grizzly was just a slightly lighter-colored, slightly grumpier version of the eastern black bear.
Which is a fundamental, almost fatal misunderstanding of biology and evolutionary ecology.
Yeah.
And we see that technological hubris just get dismantled in real time, starting in late April.
The way the journal entries shift in tone over just a few weeks is totally wild. So on April 29th, they are near present-day Culbertson, Montana. Lewis and one of his hunters spot an immature male grizzly and manage to kill it.
Right, it weighs about 300 pounds.
But what blew my mind reading the source material is Lewis's reaction to this. He doesn't treat it like a near-death experience. He treats it like a biology lab.
Well, Lewis was the quintessential Enlightenment scientist.
Yeah.
His mandate from Jefferson was to categorize and measure the natural world. So even though this 300-pound bear had literally absorbed their bullets and chased Lewis for 80 yards before dying, Lewis's immediate response is to pull out his instruments and start taking hyper-detailed anatomical measurements.
It's absurd. He writes these long paragraphs noting that its legs are longer than an eastern black bear, that its coat is a distinct yellowish brown, and that its talons are incomparably larger.
Right. The details are intense.
He even goes out of his way to meticulously note the unique placement of the bear's reproductive anatomy.
Yes, he does.
He observes that the testicles are suspended in separate pouches placed much further forward than a black bear. I mean, I'm sorry, but the man is nearly mauled to death, and his very first instinct is to examine the bear's groin.
It's hilarious, but it really speaks to the psychological armor of the Enlightenment era.
How so?
Well, if you can measure something, if you can categorize its anatomy, you can mentally control it. He actually concludes that specific journal entry by writing off the danger, stating that in the hands of skilled riflemen, these bears are by no means as formidable or dangerous as they have been represented.
Oh boy. Well, he is forced to eat those words almost immediately.
Yep.
Because that was just a 300-pound teenager. Less than a week later, on May 5th, William Clark and a hunter run into the real deal. They encounter a mature male grizzly estimated at 500 to 600 pounds.
A monster.
And this encounter reads like pure nightmare fuel.
This is the moment the paradigm completely shifts. Clark and his hunter shoot this massive bear, and the animal absorbs 10 lead balls.
10.
10. And 5 of those rounds go directly through the center of its lungs.
Wait, okay, hold on. I need to pause you right there because physically, how does that even work?
Yeah.
You put 5.58 caliber lead balls into the lungs of a mammal. How does it not drop dead instantly?
Right. To understand that, we have to look at the ballistics of an 1805 black powder rifle versus the biology of an Upper Missouri grizzly.
Okay.
The men were firing soft lead balls at relatively low velocities compared to modern firearms. When a low-velocity lead ball hits the immense, thick muscle mass and incredibly dense bone structure of a mature grizzly, it doesn't always penetrate deeply enough to immediately shatter the central nervous system.
Interesting.
Instead, it flattens out upon impact with the bone.
So they're basically punching the bear with chunks of lead, causing severe internal bleeding, but not catastrophic instant death.
Exactly. The bears were dying, but not fast enough to stop their counterattack. A grizzly bear operates on a massive reserve of adrenaline.
Right.
So after taking 5 bullets to the lungs, this specific bear doesn't just survive the initial volley, it turns, swims halfway across the turbulent Missouri River, roaring tremendously before it finally succumbs and drowns 20 minutes later.
20 minutes of fighting with shredded lungs. That is absolutely terrifying.
It completely sobered the entire expedition. The ecological differences between the eastern black bear they knew and the plains grizzly were just staggering.
Yeah, I bet.
Beyond the bone density, the grizzly possesses a distinct, heavily muscled shoulder hump. That hump isn't just fat, it is an evolutionary adaptation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's a massive anchor for muscle tissue that allows them to dig up frozen ground and, more importantly, provides explosive acceleration for high-speed charges.
And their claws are completely different too, right? I mean, I've seen pictures, they look like daggers.
Fundamentally different. A black bear has relatively short, curved claws designed for climbing trees.
Mm-hmm.
A mature grizzly cannot climb trees.
Wow, okay.
Their claws are long and straight, often 4 to 5 inches long, adapted for moving earth. When they swing those talons, they cause catastrophic, blunt force tissue damage.
And I also read that their diet on the plains made them much more aggressive than bears we might encounter in the mountains today.
That is a very crucial point. Today, we think of grizzlies mostly in high alpine environments eating berries and moths.
Right.
But in 1805, these bears were living on the open plains, consuming a highly carnivorous diet. They were feeding heavily on the thousands of bison carcasses that naturally drowned in the river or died on the prairie.
Oh, wow.
And high meat consumption correlates directly with extreme territoriality and aggression. They had no natural predators, they were the undisputed monarchs of the plains, and these humans were essentially invading their dining room.
And because the expedition has no map and no roads, they are forced to travel through the river valleys and creek bottoms. Those riparian corridors are densely packed with prairie buffalo berries and choke cherries.
Right.
So they're essentially marching a military column straight through the thickest, most bear-infested brush on the continent.
Exactly, and the danger became so constant and so severe that the captains had to enact a total logistical restructuring of the expedition's daily operations.
Okay.
The hubris was completely gone.
I can imagine.
Strict military orders were issued. Solo hunting was absolutely banned. All hunters had to operate in pairs or larger squads.
They start sleeping with their firearms loaded, primed, and lying right next to their sleeping rolls, right?
Yep.
And they essentially turn Lewis's massive Newfoundland dog, Seaman, into the camp's early warning radar system.
But even with all these precautions, the close calls are just relentless. Just days after Clark's encounter, Private William Bratton shoots a grizzly directly through the lungs.
Oh, no!
The bear chases him for half a mile. When a heavily armed rescue squad finally tracks the wounded animal down, they don't find a dying bear.
What do they find?
They find that the bear has actively dug a defensive trench in the soil, 2 feet deep and 5 feet long, and is waiting to ambush them.
That is, I mean, that shows so much intelligence. It took 2 point-blank shots to the head to finally kill it, right?
Yeah.
And when they butchered it, the bear yielded 8 gallons of clear oil. It is just a massive, terrifying machine of an animal. And Lewis himself almost gets taken out on June 14th.
Right, this is a famous story.
He shoots a buffalo for dinner, gets completely distracted watching the buffalo die, and forgets to reload his single-shot rifle. He turns around, and a massive grizzly is 20 paces away, locking eyes with him, and then it just charges.
It is the ultimate nightmare scenario. Lewis is standing in an open plain. There isn't a tree for 300 yards.
Yeah.
His rifle is totally empty.
Oh my gosh.
His only option is to retreat backward, waist deep into the freezing Missouri River, holding nothing that is espontoon, which is like a spear-like military walking staff, preparing to fight a charging grizzly bear hand-to-hand in the water.
I was literally holding my breath reading this in the source material, but for some completely mysterious reason, the bear hits the water's edge, stops, stares at Lewis, and then just turns around and runs away. I mean, it's pure luck.
It was,
Yeah.
but it permanently cemented the reality of their situation for everyone. The western wilderness demanded absolute unrelenting vigilance. However, the wildlife was only one facet of the danger. Because while they are grappling with the reality of the grizzly bear, the river environment itself nearly wipes out the entire expedition.
And this brings us to May 14th, 1805. This is a moment on the timeline that really made me sit back and think about the human dynamics of this crew. They are navigating a tricky stretch of the upper Missouri. Toussaint Charbonneau-Sacagaway's husband is steering one of the large wooden pirogues. Suddenly, a violent squall sweeps down from the plains and just hits them.
Right, and to understand the danger here, We have to look at the physics of these wooden boats.
Okay, lay it on me.
The pirogue is heavily loaded, it's sitting low in the water, and they have the sail hoisted to catch the breeze. When the sudden, violent wind of the squall hits the sail, it acts like a giant lever, forcing the boat to heel violently over onto its side. Water begins pouring over the gunwales instantly.
Now, Charbonneau was hired partly because he claimed to be an experienced French-Canadian riverman. He is supposed to be this seasoned veteran here.
Supposed to be, yeah.
So when the boat tips, you expect him to take command, but he completely freezes. He drops the tiller, he starts crying out to God, and he is absolutely useless in the crisis.
He essentially abandons the helm in a total panic. The boat is seconds away from capsizing entirely. And sitting in the stern of this rapidly sinking boat is Sacagawea, a teenager holding her infant son.
While her supposed expert husband is having a total meltdown, Sacagawea stays incredibly calm. She balances herself in the tipping boat, reaches out into the turbulent, freezing water, and begins methodically rescuing the expedition's cargo as it floats away.
And we really cannot overstate the importance of what she was pulling out of the river.
Yeah, it wasn't just supplies, right?
Exactly. She wasn't just grabbing extra food or blankets. She was saving the expedition's invaluable journals, their delicate scientific instruments, the diplomatic papers meant for native chiefs, and their core supply of medicines.
She literally saved the entire scientific legacy of the journey. If those journals and maps had sunk to the bottom of the Missouri, they would have had nothing to show Jefferson.
Nothing at all.
The expedition's purpose would have been ruined right there. I have to ask, what does this incident reveal about the internal social structure of this expedition?
I think it completely shatters the rigid hierarchy they started with.
Yeah.
You have a highly paid, supposedly expert European fur trapper, completely paralyzed by fear, while an indigenous teenage mother demonstrates total psychological fortitude and situational awareness.
It's amazing.
Meriwether Lewis, who was watching from the shore in absolute terror because he couldn't swim out to help, explicitly praised her in his journal. He wrote about her equal fortitude and immense presence of mind.
They actually named a river after her a week later to honor her, right? The Sacagawea River in north-central Montana.
Yes, it was a formal, geographical acknowledgement by the captains that her composure under extreme pressure had quite literally saved them from disaster.
So they survived the squall, and they survived the bear attacks, but as they push into early June, they hit a wall that no amount of bravery or calm under pressure can fix.
Right.
They run into a massive, terrifying geographical puzzle.
Yes. By early June 1805, they have traveled over 2,500 miles from St. Louis, and they arrive at what we now call the Marias River.
Okay.
They look ahead, and the Missouri River essentially splits into two nearly equal branches. One major river flows down from the north, and another major river flows in from the south.
Going back to our road trip analogy from earlier, this is where the map completely disappears. There is no local guide standing at the riverbank to point the way. They have to decide which branch is the true Missouri River that will lead them to the Rocky Mountains and ultimately to the headwaters of the Columbia River.
Exactly.
Why couldn't they just guess, travel up one for a few days, and turn back if it felt wrong?
Well, because of the timeline and their dwindling supplies, the pressure of this decision is monumental.
Right.
If they guess wrong and travel hundreds of miles up the wrong river, they will exhaust their provisions trying to fight the current. By the time they realize their mistake and return to the fork, they will have lost weeks of critical summer travel time.
Oh, and winter comes early up there.
Exactly. That delay would force them to attempt crossing the Rocky Mountains during a brutal mountain winter, which is a death sentence. An incorrect decision at this fork could literally doom the entire enterprise to starvation and freezing.
And the journals show that the crew is completely divided on what to do. The vast majority of the enlisted men look at the northern branch. It's muddy, it's turbulent, the water looks exactly like the muddy Missouri River they have been fighting for the last year.
Right. Visually, it makes sense.
By all visual logic, they vote north. But Lewis and Clark look at the southern fork, which is clear, and runs over a bed of smooth stones.
This is a phenomenal example of the captains applying Enlightenment scientific reasoning to override common sense.
How so?
They didn't just look at the water, they measured it. They measured the speed of the current on both branches. They took precise water temperature readings. They analyzed the geological composition of the riverbeds.
And what did all that data tell them?
They deduced that the muddy water of the north branch meant it was flowing for a long distance over soft prairie soil. But the clear, significantly colder water of the southern branch flowing over smooth, water-tumbled stones, indicated that it was coming directly and rapidly from melting mountain snow. Therefore, the southern branch had to be the true path to the Rockies.
That is so sore.
Despite the entire crew disagreeing with them, the captains pulled rank, trusted their scientific methodology, and chose the South Fork.
But they know that regardless of which river it is, the water is getting shallower, the current is getting faster, and the journey ahead is going to be incredibly brutal. They need to drastically reduce the weight they're dragging upriver.
Right, they have to ditch some stuff.
They decide to leave their larger white pirogue behind, along with heavy baggage, excess gunpowder, and provisions they won't need until the return trip. And this introduces us to The Art of the Cache, directed by Private Pierre Cruzat.
Oh, Cruzat was a one-eyed French-Canadian veteran of the river trade. He intimately understood the meticulous, almost paranoid methods required to stash equipment underground on the open plains without it being discovered by passing native parties or destroyed by the harsh environmental elements.
I keep seeing the word cache in the sources, but I always pictured it as just digging a hole and throwing some dirt over it. But
Yeah.
Cruzat's engineering is hyper-specific. Can you walk us through how he actually did this?
It is a brilliant piece of wilderness fieldcraft. First, Cruzat has the men locate a dry, high piece of ground. They carefully cut a perfect, seamless circle of prairie sod, exactly 20 inches in diameter.
Just 20 inches.
Just 20 inches at the surface. They remove that sod in one pristine piece, keeping the grass intact so it can be replaced later, like a cork in a wine bottle.
And then they just dig straight down.
Only for about 1 foot. They dig a vertical shaft straight down, 20 inches wide. But once they get past that first foot, they begin to excavate outward, expanding the hole laterally into the shape of a massive underground jug or kettle.
Oh, I see.
This subterranean chamber ends up being roughly 6 to 7 feet deep and several feet wide at the base.
But wait, if you are digging a hole that massive underground, you are going to generate a mountain of loose dirt. If you just leave a pile of fresh dirt sitting on the prairie, that is a dead giveaway to any passing scouting party that something is buried there.
Exactly. The disposal of the soil is the most critical part of the operation. As the men dig, they carefully load every single handful of excavated soil onto animal skins.
Okay.
They haul those skins over to the riverbank and throw the dirt directly into the running water, which instantly washes away all physical evidence of the excavation.
That is incredibly clever.
Once the kettle is hollowed out, they line the interior walls and floor with dry sticks, thick hay, and well-dried raw animal hides to act as a moisture barrier.
Right, to keep things dry.
Then they carefully lower their goods inside gunpowder in lead canisters, extra lead, heavy tools. They fold the hides over the top, place another layer of sticks, fill the neck with dirt, and finally, carefully place that original 20-inch sod plug back into the hole.
So, to the naked eye, the prairie grass looks completely undisturbed.
If done correctly, you can stand directly on top of the cache and have no idea there were hundreds of pounds of military gear buried beneath your feet.
But the sources reveal a really tragic irony here. Despite this genius engineering, the upper Missouri environment is just too powerful.
Yeah, the elements ultimately defeated the engineering. The ground was just too saturated.
Yeah.
The cache they dug at the mouth of the Marias River eventually suffered groundwater intrusion and collapsed, ruining a stash of precious souvenir furs and personal possessions the men had saved. But the real heartbreak happened to a similar cache they built a few weeks later at their Upper Portage camp.
That was the one that was completely inundated by spring floodwaters, right?
Yes, the river rose higher than they anticipated, the water seeped into the subterranean chamber, and it completely destroyed Meriwether Lewis's entire botanical collection.
Oh, no.
Every delicate plant specimen he had meticulously gathered, pressed, and cataloged all the way from Fort Mandan to the Great Falls was turned to rot and washed away.
All that scientific work, thousands of miles of observation just dissolved in the mud. It must have been devastating. But in the immediate term back at the Marias River, their gamble on the Southern River Branch pays off.
It does.
On June 13th, Lewis is walking on the plains, scouting ahead of the boats, and he hears a tremendous roar of water in the distance. He follows the sound, and he discovers the Great Falls of the Missouri.
Finding the falls was a moment of profound psychological relief. It proved unequivocally that the captain's scientific calculations at the fork were correct.
Right.
The native tribes had told them the true Missouri had a massive waterfall. They found the waterfall, therefore, they picked the right river.
But reading the journals, that relief seems to evaporate in about 5 minutes. Because the Great Falls isn't just one pretty waterfall you can pull your boat around.
Far from it.
It is a massive, unavoidable physical barrier consisting of 5 distinct cascading falls, dropping hundreds of feet over a stretch of nearly 10 miles.
The awe of discovery was instantly replaced by logistical dread. Because the basic law of the expedition was that they traveled by water. You cannot sail a dugout canoe up a series of cascading waterfalls.
No, definitely not.
They realized they were going to have to physically carry every single thing they owned out of the river valley up onto the plains and walk it around the falls.
Lewis initially looks at the landscape and writes that he thinks it will be a 5, maybe 10-mile detour. But the reality becomes an agonizing 18-mile trek across a rugged, sun-baked plateau. This begins the agonizing period known as the Great Falls Portage, running from June 16th to July 2nd.
On June 16th, Lewis joins Clark at the Lower Portage camp, situated below the first cataract. And almost immediately, before they even start moving the boats, a critical timeline event threatens to derail the entire expedition.
Sacagawea falls deathly ill.
She develops what modern historians believe was a severe pelvic infection, likely related to complications from childbirth earlier that year. She develops a dangerously high fever, severe pain, and becomes delirious. The captains are thrown into an absolute panic.
And it's not just out of compassion, though they did care for her. It's out of sheer logistical terror.
Exactly. They know they are approaching the Rocky Mountains. They know they need horses to cross those mountains.
Right.
And they absolutely depend on Sacagawea to negotiate with her people, the Shoshone, to secure those horses. If she dies at the Great Falls, their chances of crossing the mountains before winter plummet to near zero.
Meriwether Lewis essentially has to step into the role of a desperate frontier doctor. I was looking at the treatments he prescribed, and it is a fascinating glimpse into the medical realities of 1805.
Oh, it really is.
He treats her with mineral-rich water drawn from a nearby sulfur spring. He gives her doses of saltpeter, and he administers laudanum. Can you explain the medical logic behind this?
The medical paradigm of the early 19th century was based largely on balancing the body's systems, often through purging or drastic intervention.
Oh.
Saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, was commonly used as a diuretic to try and flush fevers out of the system. Laudanum is a tincture of opium. It wouldn't cure an infection, but it was a highly effective painkiller that could suppress her agony and allow her body to rest.
And the sulfur water.
Sulfur springs were believed to have broad restorative properties, largely due to the strong smell and mineral content which physicians associated with medicinal potency.
Interesting.
It was a desperate combination of folk remedy, hoping for the best, and aggressive symptom management. But amazingly, whether due to the rest, the hydration, or her own sheer physical resilience, her fever breaks, and she shows rapid recovery by June 20th.
Her resilience is just staggering, and her recovery allows the men to finally turn their attention to the nightmare of the portage. Because they are looking at these massive dugout canoes, which weigh thousands of pounds each.
You can't just pick those up.
They couldn't just throw them on their shoulders and walk for 18 miles. They realize they have to build crude transport wagons.
This is where the environment mocks them again. They need to build heavy-duty wagons, but they are standing on the high plains. There is no lumber yard, and there are virtually no trees.
They scour the landscape and finally find a single massive cottonwood tree near the river, the only species with a trunk wide enough to yield solid, one-piece wooden wheels.
They fell the cottonwood and sliced cross-sections of the trunk to create these heavy, solid wooden wheels. For the axles and the tongues of the wagons, they harvest smaller, flexible willow trees.
Desperate times.
They are so desperate for materials that they even dismantle the main mast of the white pirogue they left hidden at the cache, repurposing it as a structural axle.
Beginning on June 21st, they haul these waterlogged dugout canoes out of the river, strap them and thousands of pounds of military gear onto these makeshift wagons, and the men strap themselves into harnesses and start dragging them across the prairie.
It's just brutal labor.
I want to paint a picture for the listener. Imagine doing a half marathon in 90-degree summer heat, dragging a minivan on wooden wheels. Now imagine doing that barefoot over a field covered in broken glass.
The broken glass in this scenario is the prickly pear cactus.
Yes. The entire plateau is densely carpeted with patches of prickly pear.
The botany of the prickly pear is incredibly aggressive. Their spines are not just sharp, they are stiff and designed to penetrate and lodge into flesh.
Ouch.
The men were wearing soft, thin, deerskin moccasins, Those thorns pierced right through the leather, driving deep into the soles of their feet, snapping off and leaving their feet bloody, swollen, and highly susceptible to infection.
The journals describe the men frequently collapsing in their tracks from sheer physical exhaustion, their feet completely shredded. And because they are dragging such immense weight over uneven ground scarred by deep ravines, those crude cottonwood wheels and willow axles are constantly snapping under the strain.
Which means the men have to drop the harnesses, unload the canoes, find more willow, repair the axles using only rudimentary hand tools in the blistering sun, reload the gear, and start pulling again.
Just endless.
It was a cycle of pure physical agony.
But here's the detail that completely blew my mind. While the men are bleeding and collapsing, Captain William Clark is doing what he does best. He is obsessively mapping the route.
All right, he can't help himself.
He decides to conduct a rigorous inch-by-inch land survey of the entire 18-mile portage route.
He is using a circumferentor, which is a large, heavy surveyor's compass mounted on a tripod, and a tool known as a Gunter's chain.
I keep seeing Gunter's chain in the text. Why on earth is he dragging a heavy steel chain through a cactus patch in the middle of a survival situation?
Well, the Gunter's chain was the standard precision surveying technology of the era. It measured exactly 33 feet in length and consisted of exactly 50 heavy steel links connected by rings. You would literally stretch it tight, mark the spot, walk forward, and stretch it again. By counting the chain lengths, Clark could map the distance with absolute mathematical precision.
He even takes out a reference book he brought along, Owen's Dictionary, which described how to use basic trigonometry to measure vertical objects. He stands next to the roaring waterfalls, takes out his instruments, and calculates the precise dimensions of the falls, determining that the great pitch drops exactly 87 feet and 3/4 of an inch.
The 3/4 of an inch is what is so revealing.
Right.
Why go to that level of precision while your men are passing out from heat stroke? Psychologically, mapping was how the captains maintained control. In an environment that was actively trying to kill them, where the bears were unkillable and the river was unnavigable, applying mathematical order to the chaos of the Great Falls was a way of asserting dominance over the landscape.
It makes sense.
It was a coping mechanism as much as it was science.
Well, the environment reminds them exactly who is in charge on June 29, 1805, because the environmental challenges of the Great Falls reach a terrifying cinematic climax.
It is a scene right out of a disaster film. Captain Clark, Sacagawea, Toussaint Charbonneau, and the infant baby Pomp are walking across the plains near the falls to survey the route. Suddenly, the sky turns black.
Just out of nowhere.
A violent, localized supercell thunderstorm strikes the area with terrifying speed.
To escape the sheer force of the wind, Clark looks for shelter and leads the group down into a deep, dry ravine about a 1/4 mile above the main waterfall.
That was a nearly fatal miscalculation of prairie hydrology.
Yeah.
Within minutes, the supercell unleashes a torrent of massive rain and hail on the plains above them. Because the ground is baked hard by the summer sun, it cannot absorb the water. All that massive volume of water seeks the lowest point, and the dry ravine they are standing in quickly becomes a conduit for a catastrophic flash flood.
Clark looks up the ravine and suddenly notices a literal wall of rising water and mud barreling down the channel directly toward them.
He realizes they have seconds to react. He immediately scrambles up the steep, muddy, collapsing bluff of the ravine.
With the baby.
He is literally pushing Sacagawea and her infant baby up the slippery embankment ahead of him, digging his fingers into the mud.
And what does Charbonneau do? The seasoned wilderness veteran, he freezes with fear again.
Charbonneau is completely paralyzed by panic. He scrambles up a few feet, gets stuck, and just screams, failing to assist his wife or his child.
Classic.
The water is rising with terrifying speed. It surges to 10 feet deep in a matter of minutes, eventually peaking at 15 feet.
Oh my gosh.
It becomes a raging torrent of mud, rocks, and debris. Clark is waist deep in this torrent, fighting the current, shoving Sacagawea up over the lip of the ravine to safety just before the water can sweep them over the falls.
They survive by inches, but the toll the flood takes on their equipment is devastating. The torrent sweeps away Clark's large surveyor's compass, which was a critical loss. They had no equivalent replacement for precision mapping.
None at all.
He also loses his elegant military musket, his umbrella, his shot pouch, and his powder horn.
Charbonneau, in his panic, loses his gun, his shot pouch, his powder horn, and his tomahawk, leaving their primary interpreter completely without hunting or defense gear.
Unbelievable.
He even managed to lose Meriwether Lewis's personal wiping rod, which severely complicated the maintenance of Lewis's primary rifle.
But the most heartbreaking loss is Sacagawea's gear. She loses the infant's cradle board or beer along with all of the baby's bedding. This means a 4-month-old infant is suddenly exposed directly to the severe elements right after his mother had just survived a near-fatal illness.
And we have to remember, while this life-or-death struggle is happening down in the ravine, the main portage crew is caught out on the open, treeless plains, getting absolutely battered by the exact same storm.
The journals describe the hail falling on the plains, and it isn't normal hail. Meriwether Lewis and Private Joseph Whitehouse actually picked up the hailstones and measured them.
Of course they did.
They were 7 inches in circumference and weighed 3 ounces each. That is essentially baseball-sized ice falling from the sky.
Because the men were working nearly naked due to the extreme summer heat of dragging the wagons, they had no protection against the wind-driven hail. It bruised them severely.
I can't even imagine.
Several men were physically knocked to the ground by the impact, suffering concussions and bleeding heavily from their heads and bodies.
When the battered, bleeding crew finally drags themselves into the upper camp after the storm passes, Clark has to immediately distribute a dram of hard spirits and warm soup just to prevent widespread hypothermia, paying special attention to trying to warm up Sacagawea and the baby.
It was a brutal physical beating. Having lost so much critical time to the agonizing portage and so much essential equipment to the flash flood, the expedition is in a desperate position.
Yeah, they are on a ticking clock.
They have bypassed the falls, but the river above is shallower and faster. They need a fast, lightweight way to travel. And this brings us to early July and the introduction of a technological marvel that was supposed to be their salvation.
Yes, it was simply called the Experiment. This was a highly engineered, collapsible iron frame boat designed by Thomas Jefferson and Meriwether Lewis in Washington before the expedition even started.
Right?
They had it custom fabricated at the Harper's Ferry Armory in Virginia, and they hauled this heavy skeletal iron frame thousands of miles across the continent just for this exact moment.
The theoretical concept was actually quite sound. The iron skeleton was incredibly lightweight compared to a solid wooden hull of the same size.
Okay.
The plan was to haul the pieces past any major obstacles, assemble the frame on the upper river, wrap it tightly in stitched animal skins, and create a swift, high-capacity transport vessel that could glide over shallow water.
Between June 18th and July 8th, Lewis, Sergeant Patrick Gass, and John Shields worked feverishly at the Upper Portage Camp to assemble this 36-foot, yawl-shaped vessel. It is Lewis's pride and joy.
He was so proud of it.
The hunters go out and harvest 28 elk and 4 buffalo just for their hides. They shave the hair off, stitch the hides tightly together, and stretch them over the iron ribs. Lewis writes that it looks like a masterpiece of engineering.
It looked beautiful, but there was a fatal flaw in the logistics, and it comes down entirely to local geography.
Which was?
Standard, centuries-old boat-building procedure dictated that the seams of a leather-hide boat must be sealed with hot pine tar or pitch to make it waterproof. But as Lewis scans the plains surrounding the Great Falls, he realizes a crushing truth: there are absolutely no pine trees in the region.
The environment completely betrays the engineering. Without pine tar, the boat is useless. So Lewis, ever the scientist, tries to improvise. He concocts this experimental sealant by boiling together a mixture of crushed charcoal, beeswax, and buffalo tallow, which is rendered animal fat. They smear this hot, sticky mixture all over the seams of the skins, hoping it will hold.
On July 9th, the entire crew gathers at the riverbank, and they launch the experiment into the Missouri River.
And for a glorious, fleeting few minutes, it actually works. Lewis writes proudly in his journal that it sits in the water like a perfect cork. You can just imagine the profound relief washing over him. His pet project is going to save the day.
But then, physics and thermodynamics take over.
Can you explain exactly what happens here? Why doesn't the wax and fat hold?
It comes down to temperature and material properties. The beeswax and buffalo tallow mixture is pliable and sticky when it is warm.
Right.
But the water of the upper Missouri, coming fresh off the mountain snowmelt, is freezing cold. When the hull of the boat hits that freezing water, 2 things happen rapidly. First, the cold water rapidly chills the warm animal hides, causing the leather to shrink and pull tight against the stitches.
Oh.
Second, the extreme cold causes the tallow and beeswax compound to instantly harden and become brittle.
So you have the leather shrinking and pulling while the sealant turns into brittle glass.
Exactly. The cohesive bond shatters. As the boat flexes slightly in the current, the brittle tallow simply cracks and flakes off. separating completely from the wet leather.
The seams just violently open up, the water rushes in, the boat begins to leak rapidly, and it sinks to the bottom of the river on the exact same day it was launched. I can't even imagine how humiliating that must have been for Lewis.
It was a massive blow to his pride and his timeline. With autumn approaching, they have absolutely no time for further modifications or experiments.
No time at all.
A deeply disappointed Lewis is forced to abandon the experiment, caching its heavy, useless iron frame in a hole in the ground. The exhausted men, whose feet are still bleeding from the cactus, are forced to grab their heavy axes and hastily chop down massive cottonwood trees to carve out more heavy wooden dugout canoes to replace it.
It is such a stark contrast. The highly engineered, rigid iron boat sent by the president is a complete, inflexible failure. But while Lewis is mourning his sunken boat, we see that Sacagawea's traditional knowledge proves to be the ultimate reliable multi-tool for the expedition.
Yes, absolutely.
Because she is quietly, daily, keeping these men alive.
The historical narrative of Lewis and Clark often romanticizes Sacagawea merely as a guide pointing a finger at a mountain. But contemporary scholarship rightly emphasizes her indispensable daily contributions as a cultural intermediary, a survival forager, and a living symbol of peace.
Let's look at the dietary reality of this expedition. The men are doing brutal physical labor, burning thousands of calories a day. To sustain that, they are eating up to 9 pounds of pure bison meat per man every single day.
9 pounds.
If you eat nothing but 9 pounds of lean meat for months with absolutely zero vitamin C, you're going to develop scurvy. Your teeth will fall out and your wounds won't heal.
That is where Sacagawea intervened. She utilized her traditional indigenous foraging skills to locate essential edible roots and tubers, specifically a type of wild artichoke. And the method she used is fascinating.
Oh, this part blew my mind.
She knew exactly where to find them by locating the subterranean caches hoarded by meadow mice.
Wait, she was stealing food from mice?
Essentially, yes. The meadow mice would gather the artichokes and store them underground for the winter. Sacagawea knew how to spot the subtle signs of these nests.
That's incredible.
She would dig them up with a sharpened stick, extract the artichokes, and boil them for the men, providing a crucial, life-saving nutritional supplement that staved off scurvy and severe nutritional deficiencies in the crew.
That is brilliant. She let the local ecology do the gathering, and she just harvested the results. But reading further into July, the sources suggest that even more important than the calories she provided was the sheer geopolitical value of her physical presence.
Yes, under the strict diplomatic customs of the Plains and Plateau Indian nations during this era, a war party never travels with women and children.
Never.
Never. That was a universal cultural indicator across dozens of different nations.
I want to frame this for the listener. Imagine you are a native scout observing from a bluff. You see this massive, heavily armed military expedition of over 30 men moving aggressively through your territory. They have military rifles, they look strange, they are moving fast.
It looks like an invasion.
That looks exactly like an invasion force, and your first instinct is to gather your warriors and ambush them. But then you look closer, and you see a teenage girl walking casually among these heavily armed men, carrying an infant baby and a cradle board on her back.
Her mere presence immediately neutralized the perceived threat. She acted as a living, breathing token of peace, as Clark called her.
Wow.
By simply being there, she visually communicated to any distant, observing tribes that the intent of this heavily armed corps was peaceful. She prevented potential ambushes long before the captains even knew they were being watched from the hills.
And they needed every bit of safety they could get because as we move into mid-July, the tension is relentless. They finally get back on the river in their newly carved dugout canoes, but the grizzly bears are still an absolute menace.
Always the bears.
On July 15th, Private Hugh McNeil has a terrifying run-in that highlights just how desperate these fights were.
McNeil is riding a horse through some thick brush near the river when his mount is suddenly spooked by a hidden grizzly. The horse violently bucks, throwing McNeil directly out of the saddle onto the ground, landing right under the nose of the massive bear.
The bear rears up on its hind legs, preparing to strike him with those massive blunt force claws. McNeil is on the ground, acting on pure, blind adrenaline.
He has no time to reload.
He swings his heavy military musket like a baseball bat and strikes the bear squarely over the head. He swings with such immense, desperate force that he completely shatters the solid wooden stock of his musket and actually cuts the bear's skull deeply with the metal trigger guard.
The desperation of that blow stunned the animal just long enough for McNeil to scramble to his feet and climb up a nearby flimsy willow tree.
Thank goodness.
And because, as we established earlier, adult grizzlies cannot climb trees due to their claw structure, McNeil survived. But he remained trapped in the branches of that willow for hours, watching the bear pace below him until it finally got bored and wandered away.
It is just one brush with absolute disaster after another. But as we move into August, the tone of the journals shifts. The sheer survival narrative takes a back seat to a profound, looming geographical revelation.
They're getting close.
They are finally leaving the plains behind. They are approaching the Rocky Mountains.
And this brings us to the core geographical myth that drove the funding, the planning, and the psychological hope of the entire expedition. Since the Enlightenment era, European and early American geographers operated under an absolute belief in the concept of symmetrical geography.
I want to make sure I understand this because it sounds crazy to a modern person who has seen a satellite map.
Wow.
What exactly does symmetrical geography mean in 1805?
Well, it was a philosophical belief that the universe, and therefore the Earth, was created with perfect balance and symmetry.
Okay.
Geographers looked at the eastern half of North America, specifically the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachians are essentially a series of manageable, heavily forested ridges with rivers flowing gently down both sides.
Right, they aren't too crazy.
Because of the belief in symmetry, they assumed with absolute certainty that the Rocky Mountains in the west would be an exact mirror image of the Appalachians in the east.
So they expected to find a single narrow ridge of hills. They believed they could navigate their canoes to the very headwaters of the Missouri River, pull the boats out of the water, make a short, easy portage of maybe a half-day's walk over a gentle hill, and immediately drop their canoes into a massive, deep, westward-flowing river that would take them straight to the Pacific Ocean.
That was the dream of the Northwest Passage, a simple, symmetrical, commercially viable water route across the continent.
It sounds so easy when you put it like that.
And on August 8th, that dream feels incredibly tangibly close. Sacagawea looks at the landscape and recognizes a prominent geological feature called Beaverhead Rock, named because the stone formation looks exactly like a swimming beaver.
Right.
She tells the captains that she recognizes this place. Her people, the Shoshone, spend their summers just beyond the mountains on a river flowing west.
She gives them the geographical confirmation they have been waiting a year and a half to hear. This pushes Lewis to move fast. He knows they are close. On August 12th, leading a small advance scouting party with George Drouillard, John Shields, and Hugh McNeil, Lewis leaves the boats behind and ascends the gentle eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, following an ancient, well-worn Indian trail.
They are heading toward the crest of what we now call Lemhi Pass.
You can feel the intense anticipation building in his journal entries. Just below the summit, the trail narrows, and Private McNeil finds a tiny, bubbling creek.
This is a great moment.
He stops, stands over it, placing one foot on the left bank and one foot on the right bank, and triumphantly thanks God that he has lived to bestride the mighty and heretofore deemed endless Missouri.
Lewis then stops, kneels down, and drinks from that cold, pure spring. He records it in his journal as the most distant fountain of the waters of the mighty Missouri.
Just a beautiful moment.
It is a moment of profound, poetic triumph. They have reached the absolute source of the river they have been fighting, cursing, and bleeding over for more than a year.
But that triumph lasts for only a few more footsteps. Because then, Lewis leaves the spring, walks the final few yards to the actual summit of Lemhi Pass, which sits at an elevation of 7,339 feet, and looks over the edge.
I want to give this moment the breathing room it deserves.
Please do.
Imagine the psychological buildup. Lewis is carrying the expectations of Thomas Jefferson, the scientific community, and his exhausted men. He expects to look over that crest, see a sweeping, gentle plain sloping downwards, and a beautiful, wide river waiting to carry them to the ocean.
This is the exact moment where Enlightenment geographical theory violently collides with brutal geological reality.
Lewis reaches the top, looks west, and the dream dies instantly.
Oh, man.
Instead of a gentle plain, he is confronted with a view that must have made his blood run cold. He writes that he sees immense ranges of high mountains, still to the west of us, with their tops partially covered with snow.
It wasn't a single symmetrical ridge. As he looked west, he saw a chaotic, endless wall of jagged, snow-capped peaks stretching as far as the eye could see into the horizon. He was looking at the Bitterroot Range, one of the most rugged, impenetrable mountain systems on the continent.
The crushing psychological reality of that view cannot be overstated. There was no easy half-day portage. There was no navigable river waiting for their canoes. There was no direct commercial water route across the continent.
This is all a myth.
In that single, devastating glance from the top of Lemhi Pass, the centuries-old myth of the Northwest Passage was completely and forever shattered.
It is arguably one of the most profound pivot points in American history. The map of the continent was instantly rewritten from a manageable commercial highway into an immense, terrifying physical barrier.
Right.
But Lewis doesn't have the luxury of time to mourn the death of the myth, because the reality of those mountains is staring him in the face. They cannot cross those endless snow-capped peaks in wooden canoes.
No way.
They absolutely desperately need horses to carry their gear over the passes. And the only people in this vast wilderness who have horses are the Shoshone.
So, swallowing his disappointment, Lewis descends the steep western slope, tasting the waters of the Pacific slope for the first time. The next day, August 13th, his advance party is walking down a dusty path when they suddenly encounter 3 Shoshone women.
Now, Lewis knows that this first contact is the most critical diplomatic moment of the expedition. If he startles them, they will run back to the village, report an attack, and the Shoshone warriors will wipe out his small party.
He has to be very careful.
He lays down his rifle, tells his men to stay back, unfurls an American flag, and advances alone, unarmed.
He approaches the women, who are understandably terrified, and to demonstrate his peaceful intentions, he rolls up his sleeve to show his white skin, and then he paints their cheeks with vermilion paint, which he had learned was a universal Shoshone symbol of peace.
The gesture works. The women calm down and guide Lewis's party back toward their main village, where they are suddenly intercepted by Chief Kamehameha and a force of 60 heavily armed mounted warriors.
50 of them.
Initially, Kamehameha is cordial. He dismounts and embraces Lewis. But Lewis notes in his journal that the underlying tension among the warriors is incredibly thick.
Why were they so tense? If Lewis is showing peace signs, why are the Shoshone ready to fight?
Well, because the Shoshone had every reason to be highly suspicious and deeply paranoid. The tribe had recently suffered a devastating surprise attack from their bitter enemies, the Blackfeet, who possessed firearms.
Oh, wow.
The Shoshone had lost 20 warriors, many of their homes, and numerous precious horses. They were heavily traumatized and terrified that these strange white men were actually an advance party attempting to lure them into another ambush.
So the stakes are at their absolute peak.
Mm-hmm.
Lewis is stranded in front of an impassable mountain range. Winter is approaching rapidly, and the people holding the only key to their survival, the horses, are deeply traumatized, heavily armed, and ready to fight at the slightest provocation.
It is a powder keg.
Lewis realizes he cannot negotiate this alone. He convinces Kamehameha to bring his people back over the pass to meet the main party coming up the river.
On August 17th, William Clark and the main body of the expedition finally arrive at the rendezvous point near the Shoshone encampment. And as the canoes approach the shore, Sacagawea begins to dance with joy.
She knows she is home.
She is spinning around and sucking her fingers, which was a cultural sign indicating that she had suckled with these people, that these were her native kin.
Before the formal council even begins, Sacagawea spots a woman in the Shoshone crowd. They run to each other and embrace, weeping. It was her childhood best friend.
That is amazing.
They had been captured together in the exact same battle by the Hidatsas years ago, but her friend had managed to escape and make it back to the tribe. It's an incredible cinematic reunion, but the main event is still the diplomatic council. The captains need those horses.
The formal negotiations begin that afternoon inside a large circular willow brush council tent. In accordance with strict Shoshone diplomatic custom, all the participants remove their moccasins before smoking the pipe of peace, signaling that they would act truthfully.
But the actual communication in that tent is a linguistic nightmare. Just to speak a single sentence to Chief Kamehameha, the captains had to use an absurdly complex 5-step translation chain.
It really highlights the immense cultural and the linguistic chasm they were trying to cross.
Walk us through that chain.
Well, the captains would speak English to Private François Labiche. Labiche, who is bilingual, would translate the English concepts into French for Toussaint Charbonneau.
Okay, that's 2.
Charbonneau would translate the French into Hidatsa for his wife, Sacagawea. And finally, Sacagawea would translate the Hidatsa into Shoshone for Chief Kamehameha.
And then the chief's reply had to travel all the way back up that chain.
Imagine trying to explain complex Enlightenment geopolitical concepts like Thomas Jefferson or sovereignty or exclusive trade rights through four different cultural lenses and vocabularies that might not even have equivalent words for those
It
concepts.
is incredibly slow, it is highly vulnerable to fatal miscommunication, and the tension in that willow brush tent is suffocating. Everyone is on edge, waiting for a trap to be sprung.
But then, the most wildly improbable event of the entire expedition occurs. As Sacagawea sits down, takes a breath, and prepares to begin the difficult task of translating the first Hidatsa phrase into Shoshone, she looks closely at Chief Kamoete's face.
She realizes it's her brother.
She jumps up from her seat, runs across the sacred circle, throws her blanket over the chief, and begins to weep profusely, calling out his name. Kamehameha is equally moved, embracing her. It is a profoundly dramatic, emotional explosion in the middle of a tense geopolitical summit.
If you wrote that in a movie script, people would say it's too unrealistic.
Exactly. What does this massive emotional release actually mean for the expedition in that moment?
In an instant, that emotional explosion completely dissolves the suffocating geopolitical tension in the room. All the Shoshone fear of an ambush, all the paranoia about a Blackfeet trap, it just evaporates.
Wow.
The explorers are no longer viewed as dangerous potential enemies. Because of Sacagawea, they are suddenly welcomed as literal family.
The diplomatic dynamic flips entirely. The captains allow the siblings time to weep and talk, and then through her translation, they explain their mission and their desperate life-or-death need for horses to cross the mountains. And because of that familial bond, the negotiations are overwhelmingly successful.
They got what they needed.
The captains trade blue glass beads, uniform coats, knives, and metal scrapers.
In return, they secure exactly what they need to survive. 29 sturdy pack horses, saddles, and the invaluable services of an experienced Shawnee guide they called Old Toby, who knows the hidden, treacherous paths through the Bitterroot Mountains.
The following day, August 18th, happens to be Meriwether Lewis's 31st birthday. He sits in his tent and reflects in his journal. He writes about feeling energized by the successful trade, viewing his past years as mostly wasted, and vowing to accomplish something lasting for his nation in the future.
It's a moment of immense personal and professional triumph for him. But as historians, we have to look at the sobering postscript to this diplomatic miracle. When we look at the historical records regarding how the participants were compensated for this event, it reveals the stark inequalities of the era.
Yes, the contrast is bitter. When the expedition finally returned to St. Louis in 1806, the U.S. government paid Toussaint Charbonneau, the man who panicked in the squall and lost his gear in the flood, $533.33 and granted him 320 acres of land for his services as an interpreter.
Anne Sacagawea, the teenage mother who saved the scientific journals from the river, who foraged to keep the men from dying of scurvy, whose mere presence neutralized native attacks, and whose emotional reunion with her brother literally secured the horses that saved the entire expedition from freezing to death in the mountains.
What did she get?
She was paid absolutely nothing. $0. 0 acres.
It is a harsh reality of the historical record. The society that sent the expedition was incapable of formally recognizing her value. But her legacy is undeniably etched into the survival of the Corps. Without her presence, her geographic memory, and her familial ties, they would have lacked the diplomatic leverage to secure those horses. They would have been stranded at the base of the Rockies.
Which brings us to the end of this incredible timeline from April to August 1805. When you step back and look at the sheer arc of what we just covered, it is staggering.
They survived charging grizzly bears that absorbed musket balls like they are nothing. They survived a violent flash flood that nearly ground them in a muddy ravine. They dragged heavy wooden wagons barefoot over miles of prickly pear cactus. They watched their highly engineered iron boat, the symbol of their technological superiority, crack, leak, and sink to the bottom of the river.
They witnessed the violent, devastating death of a centuries-old geographical myth at the crest of Lemhi Pass, replacing the comforting dream of a gentle, symmetrical river with the terrifying nightmare of the jagged Rocky Mountains.
Only to be saved at the absolute 11th hour from total disaster by an incredibly improbable, deeply human family reunion.
But I must warn the listener, while they got the horses they so desperately needed, their trial is far from over. As we look ahead to part 3 of this series, the expedition now has to take those 29 horses and physically cross the treacherous Bitterroot Mountains.
Oh man, winter is coming.
Winter is fast approaching. The snow is already falling on the high peaks, their food is running out, and their survival is now placed entirely in the hands of a guide named Old Toby.
It is going to be a grueling, starving fight for survival. But before we leave you today, I want to circle back to the thought we started with. We talked about the comfort of modern maps, the predictable blue line on your phone, and the absolute terror of the blank space.
The extreme fragility of venturing into the absolute unknown.
Exactly. I want you to think about the sheer terrifying fragility of history. What if Sacagawea hadn't recognized her childhood friend in the crowd that day? Or worse, what if Chief Kamehameha had been one of the 20 warriors killed in that Blackfeet raid just weeks prior?
If he had died in that raid, the familial connection doesn't exist.
The diplomatic leverage of the entire Corps of Discovery vanishes in an instant. The Shoshone, out of fear, likely refused to trade the horses. The Lewis and Clark expedition, unable to carry their gear, likely starves or freezes to death on the eastern slopes of the Rockies, and the geopolitical map of North America looks completely different today. History wasn't made by grand, rigid iron boats or standard-issue military muskets. It hung entirely by the fragile thread of a sister recognizing her brother's face in a crowded, tense tent.
It is the ultimate reminder that in the vastness of the unknown, survival often comes down to a single human connection.
Something to mull over until next time. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will see you for part 3.